Welcome and good evening. I'd like to welcome Mark Godfrey, who is an art historian and a curator, and until 3 years ago, in fact, taught art theory and history here at the Slade, but now is a curator at the Tate Gallery. He's currently organising exhibitions on Richter and Baretti for next year, and was a curator of the major Alÿs exhibition this year. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's kind of great to be back here. Some of you might, I recognise a couple of people, but up until 3 years ago I was teaching here, and in fact organised the series of talks on Wednesdays. So I've been sort of waiting for an invite back. It took time, but I hope I don't disappoint. So I thought I would end this video now and talk about a lot of things to do with the Francis Alÿs show. And just not to make anyone feel guilty, but to give myself a sense of how familiar you are with the topic. I was wondering if anyone who saw the show could put up your hands. Okay, so about half of you. So hopefully it won't be boring for those of you who saw the show, but I thought I would talk about a lot of things. Now, this is the structure of my talk. To start, how a show at Tate begins, because I was asked not just to simply read out my catalogue essay or to talk about Francis's work, but talk about the mechanics of the show as well as some of the critical or theoretical ideas that arise from it. So I'll start with that and carry on. So to start, how the show begins. I mean, a lot of people ask, how is it that an artist is chosen to have a retrospective or a monographic major show at Tate Modern? And how long in advance do you work on a major show? Well, what I would say to that is that the directors and the curators at Tate, like in any other museum, are always alert to major emerging practices in contemporary art. And I guess Vicente Tordoli, who was director up until the summer, and Nick Sirota and Sheena Wagstaff, and the other people at the top of Tate, were aware of Francis Alÿs's practice since the mid-90s, when he began to show his art in biennials and across the world. Also, he had a presence with the Listen Gallery here in London. In 2004, I think it was, he did a major project with Art Angel. That was a project called Seven Walks. It came out of a lot of time that he'd spent in London, and it included a number of important works. One was called Guards, where he set free 20 Coldstream guards at different places in the city of London and got them to walk around until they saw each other where they were to fall into military step, and then they formed a grid and moved across and broke the grid when they crossed the bridge. There was another piece called The Night Watch, which involved a fox running around the National Portrait Gallery. Anyway, after that show, I guess it crystallized in the minds of the directors of the Tate that this was a really significant artist, and I probably think it was at that time that he was invited to do a show. Now, that was 6 years in advance of the show, so there's that kind of level of preparation. At the time, I was working at the Slade, and I wrote a big piece on Francis Alÿs for Art Forum. And after writing the piece, I contacted Vicente Tordoli, as I said, the director, and I said, you know, if ever Tate does a show of Francis's work, I'd love to work on it as a sort of external co-curator. And I don't know why I wrote the letter, because that sort of thing doesn't happen much. But in any case, a couple of years later, I left the Slade, and on the first day that I arrived at Tate, there was just a pile of books on my desk. And one pile was a pile of books of Ronnie Horn, and the other of Francis Alÿs. So that was my indication that I was going to work on this show. And at the time, there had been no conversations with the artist other than the fact that there would be a show. So everything was completely up for grabs. Now, at the same time, this is kind of more organizational. Tate would have had discussions with other major museums to find out who else was interested in Alÿs. And the main partner, was the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Now, it's always important to share a show with other people for a number of reasons. One, it's cost saving. You know, if you're going to bring together all the works, then actually it makes a lot of sense if you transport them in a group from one museum to another. As it happens, though, the principle of this show was slightly different, which was that each of the venues in the show was supposed to kind of have its own take on Francis Alys's practice, but the shows would be united by a single catalogue. Now, when I arrived at Tate, I began to, with great enthusiasm, began to talk with Francis Alys about what kind of a show this might be. And I think the main thing that we were both really anxious about or enthusiastic about was to do something that was different from the Seven Walks Archangel piece. Now, actually that's quite a surprising thing because Tate had acquired almost every single work that Archangel had shown. And usually it's the case that a major museum would want to showcase the works in their collection and say, we've supported this artist and we've supported it by acquiring his work, and now we're going to show what we've bought. That's certainly what MoMA planned to do with their Alys show. But Francis and I thought that because this had been such a significant show in London, there was really no point in repeating that. We can use those works in collection displays whenever we want, and we wanted to do something very different. Also, we didn't want it to be a generalized retrospective because I think his practice is so broad that to do that would be a little bit meaningless. And so we developed this idea of a show called A Story of Deception that would really focus on one particular slant through his practice, and that was the coming together of poetic gestures, poetic actions, with a concern with politics. And in a few minutes, I'll show how that mapped through the show. But just to say what that meant cutting out, I don't know how much you all know about Alys's practice, but a few years ago, the Schaulager in Basel did a massive show of a project he did called the Sign Painters Project, where he would make little paintings in Mexico City, and then he would get rotullistas, or professional sign painters, to make copies of them and copies of the copies. Now, that could have filled all the space we had at Tate Modern, but we didn't include any of those because we felt that was kind of part of another aspect of his practice. Another very famous work of his is the Modern Procession, which is a work that he did on the occasion of MoMA's moving from 53rd Street in Manhattan, their permanent headquarters, to Queens, which is where they were located for a few years while their permanent headquarters was being refurbished. He organized a kind of Latin American procession from Manhattan to Queens, in which the artist Kiki Smith was held aloft on a kind of platform, and there were replicas of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and a Giacometti carried in this procession. And it was an amazing work, and you could have put together a whole show around the way in which he's engaged the idea of the museum. But again, we didn't want that. And another, I think, a major part of his practice is to do with rhythm and sound. Guards, the work I mentioned before, really has that as a strong element where you hear the guards' footsteps. There's a piece called Railings that he made in London where he trails a kind of cane along Georgian railings. And he's always been interested in musicians like Steve Reich and has done a lot of work with things like phasing. And there was another important piece called Duet, where he arrives in Venice with half a tuba, and a collaborator arrives in Venice, another part of Venice, with the other part of the tuba, and they wander through the streets of Venice until they find each other and then blow one sort of blast of the tuba. So you could do a whole show around rhythm and music, or around museums, or around Sign Painters Project, or you could... Anyway, we didn't want to do any of that, so that's to give a sense of what we were trying to do, to have a kind of focused idea for the show. Now, and those conversations continued really all the way through 2 years, and I would intermittently go and visit him in Mexico City, where his studio is, or meet up with him in other places where he was showing work. And I'd say another thing is that the actual shape of the show only really emerged about a year ago, because until that point we thought that the show would include, as about a third of its space, a major work that he was doing in Gibraltar, on the Straits of Gibraltar, between North Africa and Spain. He'd done an action which involved kids, a line of kids walking into the waves on the Spanish beach, while a line of kids walked into the waves on the Moroccan beach. so that it would look like these two lines of kids were stretching out towards each other, and the kids were carrying these little toy boats. And we were thinking that this work would premiere at the Tate and it would kind of be the major work, but in fact he felt that it hadn't really successfully concluded and he wanted to work more on it. And so the floor plans were changing quite a lot as he was making the work. We really thought it was important to have a lot of new work in the show so that people who knew his practice well would be sort of surprised by what it included. But that comes with the risk, of course, of an artist not finishing a work for the show. Okay, I just want to show you, take you now through the floor plan. Okay, here. And some of the other practicalities. So I want you to imagine that, I mean, at Tate we work with galleries, some of which are very rigid, so some of the walls we can't move, and others we can move all the time. Basically on the east side, which is where the Gauguin show is now, this whole space 1 and 2 can be one single room. This whole space over here, so 3, 4, 15, 14, that space 5, 6, 7, 13, that also can be opened up as one space. Anyone who saw the Silde Morella show might remember that that was one space. And then this whole thing at the back is also one space. This area here is kind of lifts and other things that you don't use. It's not space you can show art in. So the curators and the artists will always work together a lot to determine the details of the floor plan. And in this situation, a number of important factors were in play, mainly how to deal with a lot of video and a lot of sound works. How to show the work in such a way that there isn't a kind of really disturbing interplay of light and dark spaces. How to create daylight in the space, you know, what windows we can open up. This is the riverside over here. How to insulate sound so there isn't really bad sound interference between one room and another. And we have this amazing team of kind of audio-visual people who can really advise about how to use all those things. Now, Francis, as probably a lot of you who use film and video, is very specific about the type of medium he uses for each particular work. So some works are 16mm film, some are analog slide projection pieces, some are videos, some are other kinds of animated projections, etc. And he was very concerned that we, where possible, back projected his videos, because he felt that that has an advantage of giving greater luminosity and crispness to the image, but also that it, I'm really coldy, so it prevents people walking in front of the beam so that they don't block the image for other people. Now that meant, and he was really insistent that particularly the work Tornado, which is the new work, and the work that the show did premiere, that should be back projected. So what that meant is that we cut off some of the space within the floor plan for back projections. So this space over here was a kind of hub room. Usually that space is where you'd see art, right? But that was a hub room where there were projectors, one of which was projecting onto the wall of 14, one of them into the wall of number 5, and somewhere over there as well. Now, initially, we'd planned that that room would have 4... If this is boring, I'm sorry, but I was also... I hope... I mean, it's kind of the background of what we do as much as writing the essays, etc. But we'd hoped to sort of use this to project, in fact, in 4 directions at once. But it turned out the reason we couldn't do that was that sound would spill between one screen, the screen in 7 and the screen in 14. 7 had a really, really loud piece, and 14 had a really, really loud piece. And we didn't want to be able to hear what's going on in number 7, which is the rehearsal. It's the piece where you see this beetle going up and down a hill, and 14, which is Tornado. So some of the desires to use back projection had to be kind of cut down by the practicalities of sound design. And another thing that we were really wanted to get right, and you know, I think we did get it right, was to have a good succession of more quiet, contemplative spaces, and then spaces which were kind of quite heavy or like had a lot of sound, We wanted to have as much furniture as possible. We all know the phenomenon of going to a big video art show and, you know, spending a minute with a piece that's half an hour long because there's nowhere to sit, and feeling that terrible frustration of not being able to see a work properly. And my assistant curator, I think, was an absolute genius on sort of coming up with the right furniture for each single piece. So in some we had leather couches, in others we had these hardcore foam cubes, and all those things are kind of quite important to get the visitor experience really, really good. And I think people did say that they felt that the space was quite friendly. And the last thing I'll say before coming on to the show itself is we wanted to have, well, maybe I'll get on to that now. Okay, so I don't know why this is not. I'm just going to walk you through the show briefly. So we started off with this image. It's quite important to have a bright, a sort of enticing image outside the show, and that everyone's always anxious that we need to bring people into the shows. So we chose an image from this new work, Tornado. And it was also, well, for various reasons, it was also, I wanted to really make this tornado piece prominent in the kind of, if I could dare to say it, the branding of the show. So we had it, you know, on the front of the catalogue and also outside. So the first piece in the show was the work which gave the show its title. It's called A Story of Deception. And it was made, it's a 16mm film that was made in Patagonia. And it's a piece which comprises the film and also a painting that's on the wall that has a cut through the painting that also goes through the wall. And in these two pieces, the horizon is destroyed in two different ways. The painting, of course, is sliced. The painting has references to Fontana, who was from Argentina. And the horizon line in this film seems to melt because there's this mirage. Now, for Francis and for us, the curators, this work was quite important as an introduction for the show because it introduced the question of his interest in the relation of Latin America to the promise of modernity. And that's a theme that carries on right through his work. A lot of his work addresses the fact that Latin American societies often feel that there's a kind of promise of modernization, of economic reform, etc. But that promise is like a mirage, that it's always disappearing. Now, that doesn't just produce a sense of disappointment, although there is that, but a sense of promise all the time as well, that you're always heading towards a kind of goal. So the mirage for him is this allegory of a desire for something down the road, something that's better, but also the frustration of its disappearance. So that was the first kind of work in the show that introduces this major theme in his work, and also introduces, hopefully, the idea of working in this allegorical way, that, you know, this piece is a film of a mirage, but its meanings aren't just about hot roads in Patagonia. Its meanings are more about promise, economic collapse, dreams, desires, etc. The next thing you saw as you turned the corner was a work he did called The Loop. And that also served as a sort of mini introduction. He made The Loop as one of his first contributions to biennials. He moved from from Belgium to Mexico City in the mid-80s, as I'll say in a minute. But in the mid-90s, he began to show his work in biennials across the world. And The Loop was this work he made when he was invited to do a show in the biennial Insight, which is organized between Tijuana in Mexico and San Diego in California. And he used the commission money to travel from Tijuana to San Diego without crossing the US-Mexico border. So he did a loop of the Pacific Rim, traveling south from Tijuana all the way New Zealand, Australia, and then up through Indonesia and Japan, etc., Siberia, and then down through Alaska and the States. And the work is represented by a globe with an elastic band around it, and then the map and a free postcard that you can take away. So that was also kind of, by the time you'd gone through these two rooms, you had the idea of the allegory and the sense of this connection to Latin America and questions of modernization, but also that this is an artist who's made a lot of works in a lot of different places, but who's reflected critically on questions about borders. For instance, The Loop can be read as a work that addresses the difficulties of Mexicans to move from one border across that border, whereas Americans can move very swiftly. So Alys puts himself almost in the position of, the person who's not allowed to move over that border quickly. I also think that that work's a kind of critical reflection on the excesses of art travel in the 90s and this phenomenon of the nomad artist that, people like Rick Tiravanija were always very much kind of praising by displaying their unfurling passport and so on. From this room, you moved into a room that we wanted to be very, very busy. And actually, looking back, I regret that it wasn't even busier. It's a room that collected a number of his pieces that were made in Mexico City. So just to recap, he'd moved from Belgium, where he trained as an architect, to Mexico City in 1986. And he moved there in the aftermath of the earthquake. And his initial projects were, in fact, architectural kind of interventions. And it was only after a while that he began to identify himself as an artist. So one of his first projects that we didn't record in the show was placing pillows in the windows of sort of cracked windows that hadn't yet been improved or sort of mended by the government. And the room included a number of works. This is a slide piece that goes on the floor called Ambulantes, which is the kind of photographic record of something that he found strange to him coming from Belgium, which was the proliferation of informal labor on the streets of Mexico City. The fact that you see all these people carrying around their trolleys of things that they'll sell in the markets and on the streets, rather than in shops. The room also contained another allegorical piece called Sometimes Doing Something Leads to Nothing, where he pushes around a large block of ice for 9 hours until it melts into a little kind of puddle. And this was another work that sort of looks at the idea of maximum effort and minimum result, that in some way all the efforts of Latin American societies to modernize sometimes seem to have a kind of minimal result. That was sort of a view through the room, and I thought it worked nicely to have this different size of projections, it was actually Francis's idea to display these objects that he calls the collectors on this metal shelf. Now, these are objects that he made with craftspeople in Mexico City. They're metallic little dogs that he would trail behind him. Inside them, there are magnets, and so it was a way of kind of walking through the city and picking up the refuse of the city on the surface of these sculptures. And I say sculptures, but they're more for him like kind of objects or playthings, and that's why we wanted to show them in this quite informal way on these industrial shelves. And you could see through there too this work at the back, which is called Cuentos Patrióticos. And it's a work he made where he circles the main flagpole in the ceremonial center of Mexico City with a sheep, and then another sheep and another sheep until a complete ring of sheep are walking in a circle with him. And it's another allegorical work that looks back to an event that took place in '68 in Mexico City, where government bureaucrats were invited to parade their support of the government in the central square, but they all went into the central square and bleated like sheep to show their sort of subservience and to protest about their subservience. And I guess my favorite moment in the whole show was when at one point I had to show around the Mexican ambassador and the cultural attaché to the embassy. And the cultural attaché turned to me and said, I was one of the sheep. He remembers in '68 he'd been working in the health ministry, and anyway, Francis had never actually met someone who this had happened to, so I put the two of them in touch. And again, this is a work that not only looks back to '68, but contemplates the circularity and the kind of rut of Mexican politics since that time. And that's a clearer shot of these collectors. So the next room was again, another Mexico City piece, but a work that began to reflect on his practice as a whole. This is a piece called Reenactments, and what he does in this piece is, on one screen, you see a video of him walking into a gun shop, buying a gun, and walking around Mexico City until he's arrested. And on the other screen is a reenactment of the same event, of that event that he did the day after, and he managed to persuade the police who'd arrested him to take part in the recreation, so they played themselves. And as well as being a work about Mexico City, violence, etc., it was also a work about the fact that all performance art and all kinds of actions are always mediated. And, you know, it opens the question of what does it mean to have a live event? Is there any kind of unmediated live event? And it opens that question up to criticism. The next kind of moment in the exhibition was around the idea of the rehearsal. And the rehearsal for him has also functioned as a kind of allegory of Latin American society, just like the mirage that I spoke. It's a different type of allegory, but here you've got the idea that that there's always that societies in Latin America are always rehearsing for an outcome that never quite transpires. The main work in this set of works is this, Rehearsal 1. I wish I had the audio track for you, but what you see is a beetle, Volkswagen Beetle, repeatedly driving up a hill, and at the same time you're hearing a kind of folk Mexican band, and they're rehearsing. And the driver of the Beetle was listening to this rehearsal as he was driving. Each time the band starts, the driver would start going up the hill, and each time the band stops, he would come back down the hill. And he never reaches the top of the hill. And this is sort of like, I think, probably the most popular of the works in the show. People were really transfixed by it. They found it had that perfect blend of kind of allegory and humor and seduction and all the noise, and everything worked well about it. And outside, we had a number of the tables that Alys has always used in his exhibitions to display the kind of thinking processes behind his work. I'll say more about those tables in a short while. Now, you then went into a room with When Faith Moves Mountains, which I think is probably his most legendary work, a piece done in 2002 in Lima, where he worked with 500 Peruvian students, all studying engineering, and persuaded them to spend a morning moving a sand dune on the outskirts of Lima. They lined up at the bottom of the dune with shovels and walked in a line up the dune, shoveling, dropping, shoveling, dropping. So at the end of the day, this sand dune would have moved. And it introduces lots of questions around ideas about futility and whether this is the work which is about an extraordinary feat, an amazing mythical achievement of all these students to have actually moved a mountain, or whether it's a work about a kind of complete frustrated event where a mountain is moved but no one can see the difference, again with maximum effort, with minimum results. It's also a work, I think, which introduces interesting questions about energy and expenditure, in as much as you've got a different kind of economy or economic model that is imaged in this work to the economic model of capitalism, which is all about efficiency and production. In this work, you've got massive waste of energy and non-productive expenditure, which is an idea that Bataille theorized in the 40s, but I think can really be seen in this work of Alys's, that you've got this almost celebratory use of massive amounts of energy without any notable, tangible outcome. Now, as you can imagine, after all those heavy works, we wanted to create a pause space. And so we had this work here. And it was a work called Silencio. And it was a work, another example of the different kinds of objects that he used. I should have said at the beginning that he makes, as you know, paintings, objects, mats, metallic dogs, as well as videos, animations, drawings, all those things. And we wanted the show to kind of capture the material breadth of his work. Now, these are produced with craftspeople in Mexico City, once again, according to a fixed schema. So there are 6 colors in each mat, There are 13 available colours of rubber, and he produced as many mats as it took to exhaust all the possible permutations. So there are, in fact, many, many more mats than we were able to show. Interesting anecdote, hopefully interesting anecdote, is that we had sized this room to fit the grid of mats perfectly, based on the measurement of one sample mat that Francis had sent us prior to the beginning of the exhibition. When we began to lay them out, it turned out that the mats were all slightly different sizes by about 1 centimetre. And that meant that towards the end of the room, they curled up the space. So we had to make a call during installation whether to slice sort of half of them, to slice a whole row of them, or to kind of include a barrier around the outside, this wooden area around the outside that you see over here. And we made this call, as you can see. Now, from that work, we came into another another one of the more heavy political works, and in fact, a work which I think is sort of really fundamental to the show, which is a work called, a very long title, Sometimes Doing Something Political Can Be Poetic, and Sometimes Doing Something Political Can Be Poetic Can Be Political. And I think I probably got the title wrong there. But it's also called The Green Line, and I was showing an excerpt of the video of it a while back. Now, The Green Line is a work that he made after looking back at the Lima piece and thinking that the Lima piece in its address to politics wasn't quite specific enough. What he did is he took an action that he'd done in the mid-90s, which involved walking through Sao Paulo with an open can of blue paint, and he transferred that action onto the situation in Jerusalem. And for 2 days, he walked through Jerusalem with green paint, trailing a line of green paint behind him. He was roughly walking in an area of the border that was called the Green Line, that had been the border between Israel and Jordan from 1948 to 1967. And that's the border that those on the left in Israel are seeking a return to, in order that on the east of that border you would have the Palestinian state. Now, what Alys did is he first of all made this action, walking through Jerusalem. Next, he formulated a set of questions about the relation of poetics to political situations. Can a poetic gesture have any meaningful impact on a stalemate political situation? And then he played the video and gave the questions to 11 different kind of commentators, some Palestinian, some Israeli, some British. And he asked them to reflect on the questions invoked by his action, on the history of Jerusalem, on the history of the Green Line, on the current situation of the Palestinian-Israeli question, and generally on these questions about the relation of politics to poetics. Now, in the installation, you have this touch screen over here, and on the screen, you've got the list of the people who Alys spoke to. And you can touch any one of their names in order to hear their commentaries. And I'll talk a bit more about that work in a few minutes. And then outside, you have these tables which show some of the preparatory drawings and the maps that he worked on. Now, and then we had another pause spot because, in fact, the Green Line is kind of really challenging in the types of questions that it invokes. And this was actually the third of a mini-series within the show of videos of children's games. He's often been interested in the idea of the children's game or the children's book illustration as a kind of an archetypal form or practice that's passed on from one generation to another. And there were 3 in the show. There was one of a boy kicking a can up a hill, another of a few boys building sandcastles that are washed away in the tide, and then this one which shows Moroccan boys skimming stones as if kind of over a border or over a gulf between countries. From there, he moved into a room which showed 110 paintings of the series Le Temps du Sommeil, or The Time of Sleep. And these are exquisite, tiny little paintings that are in some ways his most personal paintings. They feature on each of them these little tiny green lunettes. And in the little green circles, you see sort of dreamlike scenes of people doing things to each other, often sort of gymnastic experiments or kind of strange activities that remind you of maybe the language of Hieronymus Bosch or some of the surrealist Belgian painters, and a really sort of extraordinary and strange work. Then a work that brings up the question again of the relation of politics and poetics. And I think a really major work that had never been shown before, and it was a work called Tornado. Now, the practicalities of this work were really difficult, and it taught me as a curator that, when people think about video art shows and that each video that you show is simply as easy to show as anyone else, that's kind of complete rubbish. Some of the works in the show were just a matter of putting a DVD into a machine and a projector. Others meant loading up really, really massive, huge information files into hard drives and then transferring them, projecting them, etc. This work took the whole 5 days of transfer from the computer to the projector before we only got to see it the day before the show. So it caused quite a bit of nerves. But it's this amazing 45-minute video in which Alys runs repetitively into the center of tornadoes. And as he reaches the center, the screen goes from this kind of depictive image of the countryside in Mexico to a really strange, weird, monochrome blur. Again, I'll come back to that in a second. Then you came out to see a display of the sort of language and the paintings that he's worked on at the same time as working on the editing of Tornado. And they were often quite abstract or certainly non-depictive little paintings that show some of the ideas that he's kind of been concerned with in the course of the 10 years that he'd worked on the editing of that piece. And then to finish, because that piece, Tornado, was such an intense piece in its sound and in its imagery, again, we wanted the show to have a pause spot at the end. And it ended with this very simple animation called Song for Lupita, where a girl tips water from one cup into another backwards and forwards, while a record on a constant loop plays a song where the lyrics are mañana, mañana, so tomorrow, tomorrow. And it, again, evokes an idea about a kind of future that's infinitely postponed and put off. And also the idea of doing without doing, or effort that has no effect. Now, this piece outside is in Tate's collection, and it's The Night Watch. It was the piece I mentioned before. It didn't have any part of the narrative of the show, but we decided to put it there because we thought it would be a very sort of enticing piece, an enjoyable piece for the general public, people who weren't going to pay to go into the show. And I think you could see that kids were loving spotting the fox. The fox is captured by the CCTV cameras of the National Portrait Gallery as it runs around. Now, how much, do you know what time? 5:30. 5:30, okay, perfect. Right, I'm now going to talk for a little bit about another kind of side of organising the show, which is the publications, because at the same time as organising the exhibition itself, the curators work on the kind of publications that will accompany the show. And, most artists of the stature of Alys would want a major show that's co-organised by MoMA and Tate to be the occasion of a massive book. But Francis Alÿs is, I'd say, kind of one of the most humble people that you've ever met, and in fact wanted a very simple book. And we had to persuade him to actually make it slightly more substantial than what he had in mind. We came up with this publication, and a lot of time was spent thinking how to structure the book in a way that was going to be different from the structures of the other books that have come out recently. He'd, for instance, done the Fiden Contemporary Art Series book, which you probably know from the library or from your collections. There's always an artist interview, then there's a big monographic essay, and then sort of a little essay on one work, and so on. And straight after doing that, he'd done a show in Los Angeles where there'd been the problem with these two books is if you flicked through them, they looked identical. And you never knew where you were in the book when you turned to a certain page. So what we wanted to do was come up with a sort of structure of the book that would offer you new ideas, new essays on his work, but the book would kind of look distinct. And the main part of the book was a sort of entry section in the middle of the book where you had short entries written by Cuauhtemoc Medina, who's a Mexican critic and collaborator of Francis's. Short entries by him and Francis on each of the works. These entries would cover sort of all of the works he felt were most important, not just those that were in the show. So that this book is a sort of valuable resource, not just for the show. At the back of the book, illustrated in a completely different way, with little drawings by Alys, we had 11 or 12 different essays by a number of people that I commissioned. So some were art historians, T.J. Demos, for instance, who teaches here, and Mi Won Kwon from the States, or the architect A.L. Weitzman, who teaches at Goldsmiths. And then others were poets, or translators, or economists. And so we had a range of different voices on Alys's practice. And then at the front was a long essay by myself, which was a sort of introduction to the work. And I'll talk you through some of the structure of that essay in a minute. And that was illustrated in a very different way, just with images of his paintings. Okay, so that was the catalogue. But I also wanted to do something else, which is that I've often been interested, as I'll say in a minute, by his postcards. So we made a sort of alternative retrospective, which kind of gathered together all the postcards that he's previously produced and given away for free in his shows. And I felt that this functions and can function as a kind of, as I said, as an alternative retrospective to the show itself. Right. Now I want to talk for a few minutes about the structure of my particular essay and the arguments I wanted to make in the catalogue. And I'll start with a sort of anecdote, which is that in the course of organising the show, I did a sort of mini symposium, closed symposium, so not for the general public, of some of the people in London that sort of I knew were invested and interested in Alys's work. And we had about 4 or 5 art historians, and then we had a few people who'd worked with him in the past. The 5 art historians spoke in the morning, and then the other people after lunch. And in the morning, what you saw is about 150 slides, and each one was a slide of one of his videos or actions. So you have, a number of slides of Quentos Patrioticos, or of the Ice piece, or of When Faith Moves Mountains, or the Green Line Jerusalem piece, etc. Not one painting or object shown in any of those 5 presentations. And then in the afternoon, people who'd been to his studio just showed images of paintings, and people who knew him personally. And I thought this was a really weird situation, that for some reason, those people who consider themselves very invested in critical art, historical, theoretical practice didn't know how to talk about kind of half of what he does, making paintings, etc. Anyway, as a result, I set out in my catalogue essay to try and provide an account of his work that wasn't simply, that could attend to all of it, and that wasn't just a sort of chronological survey, but that wasn't sort of looking, well, he does paintings, and let's talk about the paintings, he does films, let's talk about, it wasn't ordered by medium either. So the beginning of my essay has an argument which locates what I think are 2 main structures that are in his work and that are in almost all of his works. One structure is the structure which I would call condensation. And by that I mean that for each of the works that he makes, he tries to find a very condensed form to represent it. Now that form might be a postcard, for instance, that if he makes the project in Lima, which requires like 2 years of organization, 500 people, lots of different film cameras and so on, he also wants to find one image and one line of text that will condense that project and that will be able to disperse that project when the postcard is sort of sent away. A painting is another form of condensation for him, that he will often work on a painting that will be a sort of a prevision of an action or a vision after an action. Again, sort of crystallizing the thoughts that he develops during making something into a single image. Another form of condensation might be an object, like the collector, or another kind of object he's made, like the camera guns, which we had in the show, which are kind of compressions of two different things. In the camera guns, you've got these sort of found film reels and then a gun shape. And another form of condensation is his titles, that he'll be very interested in picking a saying like maximum effort, minimum result, or sometimes doing something leads to nothing. You know, he'll create these kind of maxims or axioms, I guess they're called, axioms that are fitting to each work. So in those both the titles or those sayings, the postcards, the paintings, they're forms of sort of crystallizing each of the projects he does into an essential nugget. And that's quite different from a lot of the practices I know of and am interested in, where people were really reluctant, for instance, to reduce a complex performance to a single image. In fact, Alys is very attentive to the way in which that might happen. Now, at the same time, you have this great sort of dedication to condensing every kind of work he does. You've got this counter tendency in his work, which is towards proliferation. And proliferation for him occurs in a number of ways. One might be production. So you don't just produce one collector, one of these kind of little dog magnet things, but 100. Or when he made the sign painting project I talked about before, proliferating production of these copies of paintings. Or it might be to do with the distribution of his work. So you think about postcards. That's also a form of proliferation, that the work is taken out of the gallery and dispersed to multiple audiences who might not even be aware that they're sort of in the presence of an artwork. It doesn't really matter if they're aware or not, but the idea of that artwork proliferates to different publics. Also, the tables, the work tables that he always shows in his installations is another example of proliferation. So he's prepared to show all the archives of drawings and notes, faxes, etc., that kind of go towards the formation of a project. As much as each project is boiled down to this essential image, he'll also present all this kind of wealth of archival material that goes into each work as well. And then proliferation, another example of proliferation is the open access website that he's made. So right now you can download his videos, not all of them, but some of them from his website. And again, that's another radical form of dispersing and distributing the work. So my essay begins with this analysis of the sort of these two different structures in his practice, and then produces an argument of the kind of political importance of working like this, that there is this attempt to sort of condense and to distribute in as much a way as possible, and how different those forms of condensation are to forms that we know of, like the sound bite, for instance, that are more to do with consumer culture today. And then my essay goes into an account of the relation of politics and poetics in his work, and really addresses some of these larger questions that his work raises, for instance, about, through the Jerusalem piece, how a political situation might be addressed through an absurd, humorous, poetic act. What kind of meaningful approach to politics these poetic gestures can provide. And it gets into the end of the essay into an analysis of this new work called Tornado. And in my account of it, I try to sort of understand what it might have meant to have worked on this piece about sort of violent, an entry into a violent system in the current moment of Mexico's history, where, as you'll know, there's been this total collapse of a government and total collapse of order, and the most massive escalation of brutal violence, especially on the border zones, where Mexico, in the time that we worked on the show, every time you saw Mexico in the news, it was because 15 teenagers had just been gunned down, or group of people had been found in a mass grave with their hearts ripped out and things carved onto their heads. And just horrible stuff. And right at the time we were working on the show, Teresa Margolis, another important Mexican artist, had done a show for the Venice Biennial representing Mexico in the Biennial. And her piece had involved going to the sites of these crimes, mopping up blood from the death sites of the people killed in the drug wars, then putting sort of materials in the vats where this mopped up blood would be until the water had evaporated, taking the blood-soaked cloths to Venice surreptitiously, and then sort of putting them in water again, and then sweeping the floors of a Venetian palazzo with the blood of Mexican gangsters. So it was a kind of crazy and really, really disturbing work. Also involved hanging a flag that was also soaked in the blood of these people outside the palazzo, so that when the rain came, and it did on the opening of this night in Venice, the rain washed this Mexican blood into the canals of Venice. Anyway, so this work had been made by Teresa Margolis and theorized by Cuauhtemoc Medina in the months that we were working on the show. And I thought it was important to sort of understand Tornado in relation to this work as another. In that work, Margolis confronts the violence of contemporary Mexican society, not by stepping away from it, but by quite literally sort of stepping into it, actually into the sort of blood of this violence, and working on a completely allegorical level, so not in any way actually with blood. I felt that Alys, in his repeated journeyings into this tornado, was also asking about the relation of sort of an artist to a situation of collapse and of sort of societal disorder, and what kind of potentiality might be found in the heart of this tornado, where suddenly all your normal means of measuring and assessing the world disappear in this sort of flurry of sand and earth and this kind of blinding mess. Now, just like one or two more questions, and then I want to open it to questions. Through the show, we wanted to open up questions and sort of debates as much as possible. We had a day where we had scholars of Mexican and Latin American art and come through the exhibition with us, doing little presentations on different parts of his practice. We had various talks, etc. I was really sad that the show didn't stretch into October, because I would have loved to have done something more with students who I guess were on holiday basically between June and the beginning of September. But I do think that the show sort of opens up a number of critical questions, which, like in the writing that I'll do on Alÿs, I want to explore more. One of them, I think, is really the situation of painting in its relation to this kind of critical practice. I think that I still want to understand more how one might think of the kind of paintings that he does in a meaningful way. I can't, there's so much figurative painting and figurative painting being done at the moment that looks a certain way, sells for certain prices, etc. But there's very few people who get talked about in the way that Alÿs gets talked about, who also have an element to their practice of making tiny little images with sort of dream scenes of figures in them. And I think a really challenging question is how that language of painting is attached to this practice which addresses questions of borders, of migration, of politics, of economic collapse, etc., etc. Another set of questions I think will continue to be thought of in relation to his practice is, what it means for a European artist to base his practice in Mexico City, to have that kind of relationship to a place that, at the time he went there, wasn't considered an art world capital, what it means to work with craftspeople, etc., etc. So I think that will be another thing to be addressed. And I think that's probably as much as I'll say, but hopefully we can now begin some questions. If anyone wants to, yeah.
I'd like to just go on from what you just said, because I think those are really interesting questions. But why do you think he moved to Mexico City, or do you think he just ended up there?
I think there were quite practical reasons. I'm not exactly sure, but I think it had to do with a sort of legal requirement to do either military service or sort of voluntary service overseas or something like that. And he took his architectural training to a place that seemed probably, after this earthquake, in some need of people with that kind of an expertise or a training. So it was a sort of chance of historical events, what was happening in Brussels, his age, etc. But when he got there, he found a group of emigre artists. And it wasn't just him. There was Melanie Smith, for instance, a British-born painter, who he initially went out with. And then there was Thomas Glassford, an American sculptor. So there were a number of people who'd begun to base themselves in Mexico City. And at that point, he was very close as well to Gabriel Orozco and to Abraham Cruz Villegas, Damian Ortega, Eduardo Abaroa, and other Mexican artists. So that kind of scene began to develop at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. Yeah.
Leading on from that, there's the question of the sort of white European male in Latin America, and particularly in reference to when faith moves mountains. I'm interested in that because the history of Peru, of course, the Spaniards and slavery and mining and not unpaid labor. And I'm sort of interested, while, say, Santiago Sierra might have openly addressed the wage question, and in the video of when faith moves mountains, there's sort of mention of sort of voluntary labor. So it's kind of interesting that it's not more explicitly talked about, like he as an artist sort of furthering his vision with the help, voluntary help of his engineering students. And so I don't know, I'm kind of interested in that question of how he locates himself in the history of Europeans in Latin America.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think for that particular project, it was totally important to him that they weren't paid. And that was kind of made explicit, as you say, in the video and documentary, etc., that whereas Sierra might have produced many pieces reflecting on questions of exploitation, that Alys had to do this project through voluntary, infused sort of dedication. And remember, it was only a morning, but it was hard labor for a morning. And had to do this in order to provide a counter model to the economic systems of payment, reward, etc. So you could almost say that the kind of model of expenditure that that piece proposes has quite nice similarities with Peruvian culture. If you look back to kind of Inca culture and sacrificial economies, where you have, I guess, sort of this celebratory expenditure of excess. So I would place its relation to Latin America more in that kind of context than in the context of potential exploitation. Although I think the piece does raise the question of exploitation. Yeah.
In reference to that, it just seemed, because you described it as, again, this maximum effort for minimum results, and almost being a waste of, I guess, calculable energy in some sense. But it seemed from the responses that a lot of the volunteers felt empowered.
Yeah.
They felt like, oh, if we get a group of people together, we can really change something, which is an interesting turn on somehow it being a really, even though it seemed useless, actually being really good for those students. And I don't know if that was a calculated idea for Francis Alÿs.
I think so.
Kind of a surprise.
No, I think the idea was to find a sort of action or a gesture that would absolutely sit on the knife edge of, on the one hand, it could be interpreted as this massive waste of energy, doing something without doing anything. And on the other hand, could be this amazing, empowering gesture that could inspire people to think about the possible outcomes of group action, about what it might be to transform sort of apolitical subjects into politicized subjects, etc. But how to do that, to do both things at once, and I think it manages that really gracefully. Yeah.
Some curators would probably prefer to work on shows of dead artists for very obvious reasons. But you're the opposite, and I'm kind of the relationship of working with this artist is kind of crucial to the shows you put on.
It's an amazing pleasure to have worked with artists while I was teaching at the Slade, and then to go on to work with artists at Tate Modern. Although the next but one show that I'll do is with a dead artist. I won't do it with him, but
I think they just also they have a different thing.
I think you learn. I learned such a lot through working with Francis closely about one of the amazing things I haven't really talked about is the kind of structure of production that he sets up. So, he works so closely with a number of collaborators in Mexico City. You've got craft people making some of the things. You have video editors, sound editors. You've got Cuauhtemoc Medina, who he really works with absolutely all the time. There as a sort of theoretical voice, questioning, challenging him on certain ideas behind the work. And cameramen, Rafael Ortega, an artist in his own right, etc. But, obviously the difficulty of working with an alive artist is that, well, if you want to do works which aren't complete, as I said before, some of the things that we thought might be ready for the show turned out not to be. I don't think the show actually suffered for that, but it caused a few days of grief from my part. It was funny, on the last day of installation, I could tell that there was a room that he wasn't totally happy with. And for a while I worried about it, and then I just turned to him and said, has there always been a room in each of your shows that you're not happy with? And he said, well, yeah. I said, well, good, I'm glad to have given you the opportunity to have that room in this show too. And, I think it's important for something to go wrong in each installation, so an artist feels that there's a reason to make another in a different show again. So that was also interesting to sort of learn about problems and failures, and as well as things that go right.
I wanted to ask a question about Slade's presence in his artwork. He seems to be very present as a performer, as someone who activates the work in front of you, but at the same time doesn't seem to be forcing a particular his own biography onto the artwork, onto the viewer.
Yeah, it's interesting. Simon Starling's an artist who I think has taken a lot from Francis, but until recently, in presenting the kind of outcomes of also quite humorous poetic actions, he would never present an image of himself in his work. Whereas Francis from the beginning has always, you will always see him in his own videos. So the question of his body, his own presence is important. As you say, it was never really about his biography, but his physical attributes are necessarily there, especially in those works which have been made in Mexico City, where he kind of looks different from other people. And going through the show, someone mentioned to me that what's quite remarkable about the reenactments piece, where he gets arrested carrying a gun, is that maybe if he didn't look so obviously like a foreigner, he wouldn't have been treated with such leniency by the police. So I suddenly realized, well, yeah, that's kind of interesting, that his body, his appearance, actually impacted on what happened in that piece in a rather surprising way. He's not someone who would ever, he neither wants to hide his body in some gesture of false modesty or humility, but I don't think he's at all interested in the heroic gesture. you know, I have to say, I felt the kind of rather crude, non-thought-out responses to the tornado work. When people heard about it, they said, "Oh, it's this, you know, this obviously the mythical artist, the champion, throws himself into the tornado, and it's the whole old myth of the bravado male artist, etc." I think that's kind of the moment you watch the piece that you can't really sustain that argument because, you know, he doesn't fare particularly well in his entering the tornado. He falls on the ground, he gets covered with dust. It's not a macho piece at all. So basically, the long response is that, yes, you're right, the body is present in the work, sometimes with an important implication, maybe even an implication about the question raised before about being a European in Mexico. But it's not to do with heroics or his biography and so on. Yeah.
What struck me about the show was that some of the works were documentaries,
Yeah.
and some were just works. But if you could say a little about how he views those documentaries.
Yeah.
Are they works in themselves? Or?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I don't think it's possible to identify with his practice what is the work in any sort of, you know, to say, well, this is the work or that. If you think about When Faith Moves Mountains, there's the action, there's the live event, right? Then there's the postcard. Then there's drawings based on it. There's the documentary. The documentary video, which we showed, he distributes in one of the catalogues for that piece. That's another form of kind of mass proliferation of the work that, you know, it's sometimes quite hard to get a video of an artist's work, but he will give the videos away for free in his books. So the work can exist in a number of different forms. We showed the documentary. At MoMA, they'll show the installation, which is on 2 screens, very different kind of filmed image. They'll also show all the archive, so all those tables, whereas we didn't have that material for this piece. So the work kind of is doesn't reside in any one formal or material manifestation of the work. But he hasn't done documentaries for all of his works. Okay, so he did a documentary for When Faith Moves Mountains. He also did a documentary for a piece that we didn't have called Puente, which was a piece he did between Havana and Florida, where he got 2 lines of boats to stretch out on the horizon, so it would look like a bridge of boats stretching from Cuba to the United States. And that piece, he never sort of came up with a means of representing that project as a film installation or as a video installation. So that piece only exists as the documentary of the event. I think it's a sort of a challenge for him sometimes to, having orchestrated an action, how to find the appropriate sculptural, formal video means to show that in a meaningful way, or whether to make a documentary of it, or whether to make a documentary and the kind of video installation. Yeah.
How does he fund his projects?
Yeah, that's a really, I think, a great question. Thank you for asking it, because I think it's like the answer is really fascinating, I think, which is that his paintings sell for sort of $80,000 to $150,000, right? Little paintings, and you would have seen them at the Frieze Art Fair on about 3 different stands. Now, that's not a cynical thing, that's kind of happened through the market, but it has enabled him to maintain a total independence with his projects. So he doesn't work on commission, he doesn't work to deadlines. He can say, with Tornado for instance, if it takes him 10 years to complete the editing of this piece until he feels it's ready, that's fine. And while working on that piece, he can employ the sound technicians to do the sound editing, he can employ the video editors, he can go back to the countryside and film himself some more, etc., etc. And I think at a certain point where he realized his career was going in a certain way and that the market was having some things, you know, was positively responding to his work, he could start to work in this way, that independent of the commissioning structures that sometimes constrain artists to produce works on deadline, etc. Now, he's very candid about this, which is also, I think, and I'm coming across maybe as a bit of too much of a fan, but I kind of am. But, you know, in the publication for When Faith Moves Mountains, he describes how he sold paintings around this imagery and what he sold them for in order to fund the helicopter, which sort of goes above the dune and films from a certain angle. And no other painters that I know of are so transparent about the market, you know, that now I can sell the painting at this price, it allows me to do that. But, you know, that's what he does. And I know, because I've obviously getting into anecdote here, but I know because I've seen where he lives and seen how he lives, that this selling of paintings for quite huge prices doesn't lead to swish living arrangements in any way at all. It does lead to this huge independence and this ability to work with teams of producers on his projects. Okay, thank you very much.